A millionaire Wall Street CEO begins to suspect that money stored in his mansion's safe is mysteriously disappearing. He notices that Margaret, his trusted housekeeper of 15 years, has been frequently bringing her 6-year-old daughter Kitty to work. Consumed by suspicion, Richard decides to conduct a cruel test. He pretends to nap in his armchair and deliberately leaves the safe open. What he witnesses through his dark sunglasses changes everything. The little girl doesn't steal, but meticulously organizes the money in ascending order and identifies several counterfeit bills that someone planted among the real ones. Kitty leaves an innocent note warning about the fake money, unaware she's being watched. When Richard reads the letter, he's shocked to discover he was the victim of an elaborate scam by his own business partners, but the devastating revelation comes later. DNA tests reveal that Katie is his true daughter, the result of a relationship he abandoned years ago, and that Margaret sacrificed her own life to protect both him and the child from his enemies. Before we begin this incredible journey, please hit that like button if you love stories of redemption and second chances. Drop a comment below telling me what you think will happen next. Your engagement means everything to this storyteller. Richard Sterling stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan penthouse office, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a conquered kingdom. At 52, he commanded Sterling and Associates with an iron fist, his $200 million fortune built on ruthless deals and calculated risks. The Armani suit stretched across his broad shoulders spoke of power, while his steel-grey eyes reflected a man who had never known defeat in the boardroom. "Mr. Sterling, your 3 p.m. is here," his secretary announced through the intercom. Richard barely acknowledged her, his mind consumed by a growing suspicion that had been eating at him for weeks. Money was disappearing from his private safe at the Long Island mansion. Not large amounts, but enough to notice. Someone was stealing from him, and he had a pretty good idea who. Margaret Torres had been his housekeeper for 15 years, arriving each morning at precisely 7 a.m. to maintain his 12,000-square-foot estate. She was efficient, quiet, and until recently completely trustworthy. But lately, she'd been bringing her 6-year-old daughter, Katie, to work more frequently, claiming childcare issues. The timing was too convenient to ignore. That evening, Richard drove his Bentley through the manicured grounds of his Hamptons estate, his jaw clenched with determination. The mansion rose before him like a monument to his success, Georgian architecture with perfectly symmetrical windows that reflected the dying sunlight. Inside, Margaret was finishing her duties in the kitchen, her movements precise despite the weight of exhaustion on her shoulders. "Margaret," he called out, his voice echoing through the marble foyer, "I'll be working late in my study tonight. Don't disturb me." She nodded respectfully, wiping her hands on her apron. Behind her, little Katie sat at the kitchen island, carefully coloring a picture with broken crayons, her dark hair falling like a curtain around her concentrated face. Richard retreated to his study, the room that housed his most precious possessions. The walls were lined with first-edition books he'd never read, and behind his mahogany desk stood the massive safe that had been taunting him for weeks. He'd installed it 10 years ago, hidden behind a false bookshelf, containing not just money, but important documents and family heirlooms his mother had left him. As he settled into his leather armchair with a glass of aged whiskey, Richard's thoughts turned darker. He'd given Margaret everything, a good salary, health insurance, even helped pay for Kitty's private school. And this was how she repaid him? By teaching her daughter to steal. The betrayal cut deeper than he cared to admit, perhaps because Margaret was one of the few people he'd allowed himself to trust. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 9 o'clock, and Richard heard Margaret's footsteps in the hallway. "Mr. Sterling, I'm finishing up now. Katie and I will be leaving soon." He grunted a response, not bothering to look up from the financial reports spread across his desk. But inside, his heart was racing with anticipation. Tonight, he would finally have his proof. 20 minutes later, the house fell silent, except for the whisper of wind through the old oak trees outside. Richard remained motionless in his chair, listening to every creak and sigh of the aging mansion. He'd lived here alone for so long that he knew every sound, every shadow. Margaret and Katie should have left by now. But something felt different tonight. A presence lingered in the air, like the moment before lightning strikes. Then he heard it, the softest footstep on the Persian rug outside his study door. Richard's eyes snapped open behind his dark reading glasses, but he forced his body to remain still, his breathing deep and regular, like a man lost in sleep. The door handle turned with agonizing slowness, and he felt rather than saw someone slip into his sanctuary. His trap was about to spring, and tomorrow Margaret Torres would be looking for a new job. But as the small figure moved through his study with surprising stealth, Richard Sterling had no idea that his world was about to shatter in ways he never imagined. Through the thin slits of his barely opened eyes, Richard watched as a tiny shadow moved across his study. His heart hammered against his ribs as he fought to maintain the facade of sleep, his fingers gripping the armrests of his leather chair. The figure was small, deliberate, and heading straight for the bookshelf that concealed his safe. Katie Torres stood barely 3 feet tall, in her worn sneakers and faded yellow dress, a stark contrast to the opulence surrounding her. Her dark eyes, wide with childlike curiosity, scanned the room as if she were seeing it for the first time. She moved with the careful precision of a child who had learned to be invisible. Each step measured and silent on the expensive Persian rug. Richard's breath caught in his throat as she reached the bookshelf. How could a 6-year-old possibly know about the hidden mechanism? But to his amazement, Katie didn't even glance at the false panel. Instead, she stood on her tiptoes and ran her small fingers along the book spines, her lips moving silently as if she were reading the titles. "Daddy always said books are treasures," she whispered to herself, so quietly that Richard almost missed it. The word "daddy" hit him like a physical blow, reminding him that this child had a father somewhere, perhaps the same father who had taught her to steal. His resolve hardened, even as something uncomfortable twisted in his chest. What happened next defied every expectation Richard had built in his mind. Instead of triggering the safe mechanism, Katie simply stood there, admiring his collection of leather-bound classics. Her tiny hand traced the gilded letters on a volume of Shakespeare, her expression filled with wonder rather than greed. For a moment, she looked like any other child in a library, lost in the magic of stories she couldn't yet read. Then, Margaret's voice echoed from the kitchen, distant but clear. "Katie, honey, where are you? We need to go home." The little girl's head snapped up, her eyes darting toward the study door. Richard tensed, expecting her to bolt, but instead, Katie did something that made his blood run cold. She walked directly to the bookshelf and, with the confidence of someone who had done it before, pressed the hidden mechanism that revealed his safe. The steel door stood wide open, just as he'd left it, his trap perfectly set. Stacks of $100 bills were arranged haphazardly inside, along with gold coins and important documents in manila folders. It was a fortune that could change any life, especially that of a poor housekeeper's daughter. Richard's muscles coiled like springs, ready to leap up and catch her in the act of theft. But Katie didn't reach for the money. She stared at the open safe with an expression Richard couldn't quite decipher. Not greed, not fear, but something that looked almost like concern. She glanced back toward the door, where Margaret was calling her name with increasing urgency, then returned her attention to the safe, her small brow furrowed with concentration, as if she were solving a complex puzzle. "Katie, we're leaving now!" Margaret's voice was closer, tinged with worry. Any other child would have run, but Katie remained frozen in front of the safe, her small hands clasped tightly in front of her worn dress. Richard could see her profile in the lamplight, the delicate curve of her cheek, the way her dark eyelashes cast shadows as she studied the contents of his most private space. Then, to Richard's complete bewilderment, she stepped closer to the safe and began to carefully examine the money, not to steal it, but to organize it. Her small fingers moved with surprising dexterity as she started arranging the scattered bills into neat piles. Richard felt his entire worldview tilting on its axis as he watched this 6-year-old child treat his fortune with the reverence of a bank teller. The sound of Margaret's footsteps in the hallway grew louder, more frantic. "Kitty Marie Torres, you answer me right now." The use of her full name carried the universal threat that every child recognized. Still, Katie continued her meticulous work, her small face scrunched in concentration as she sorted through Richard's wealth with hands that should have been grabbing everything they could carry. Richard's trap had become something else entirely, a window into a mystery he didn't understand. As he watched this child handle his money with careful respect, questions flooded his mind. Who had taught her about the safe? Why wasn't she stealing? And why did watching her small figure in his study feel like staring into a mirror he'd forgotten existed? The answers would come soon enough, but they would cost him everything he thought he knew about loyalty, betrayal, and the innocent heart of a little girl who saw treasures where others saw only theft. Margaret's footsteps echoed through the marble hallway, each click of her sensible shoes like a countdown to disaster. "Katie, I'm serious. We have to go." Her voice carried the exhaustion of a woman who worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table, but also a mother's growing panic when her child doesn't respond. Inside the study, Katie worked with the focused intensity of someone far older than her 6 years. She had sorted Richard's money into careful piles, hundreds with hundreds, 50s with 50s, 20s with 20s. But something was troubling her, causing her small face to scrunch up in confusion. She held up a $100 bill to the lamplight, turning it over in her tiny hands with surprising expertise. Richard watched in fascination as she set that bill aside and picked up another, then another. Each one she examined with the same careful attention, occasionally shaking her head and placing certain bills in a separate pile. What was she doing? What? His breathing grew shallow as he realized she wasn't just organizing his money, she was evaluating it with the skill of someone who understood currency better than most adults. "These don't feel right," Katie whispered to herself, her small voice filled with concern. She held up one of the questionable bills, comparing its texture to others in the stack. Her father, wherever he was, had clearly taught her something valuable about money. Not how to steal it, but how to recognize when something was wrong. The study door creaked, and Margaret's silhouette appeared in the doorway. "Katie, what are you—" She stopped dead, her face draining of color as she saw her daughter standing in front of Richard's open safe. For a moment, time seemed suspended as mother and child stared at each other across the expensive Persian rug, the weight of the moment crushing down on them both. "Mama, there's something wrong with some of this money," Katie said with the innocent honesty that only children possess. She held up the questionable bills, completely unaware that she was standing in the middle of what appeared to be a theft. "Look, these ones feel different. Like the fake money Daddy showed me at the carnival." Margaret's hand flew to her throat, her dark eyes wide with terror. "Katie, step away from there right now." Her voice was barely a whisper, thick with an emotion Richard couldn't identify. Fear, guilt, or something else entirely. She moved toward her daughter with the careful steps of someone approaching a loaded gun, her hands extended as if to shield the child from an invisible threat. Richard's mind reeled as he processed what he'd just heard. Fake money? His money was fake? That was impossible. He'd received every bill from legitimate sources, mostly from his business transactions. But as he watched Margaret's face contort with a mixture of horror and something that looked like recognition, a cold dread began to creep up his spine. "We need to leave. Now." Margaret's voice carried an urgency that had nothing to do with being caught in Richard's study and everything to do with genuine fear. She grasped Katie's hand, but the little girl resisted, still focused on the money she'd been examining. "But Mama, shouldn't we tell the nice man that someone gave him fake money? Daddy said it's not right when people get cheated." Katie's innocent question hung in the air like a revelation. She wasn't trying to steal, she was trying to help. The realization hit Richard like a sledgehammer to the chest, making him question everything he thought he knew about this child and her mother. Margaret's face had gone completely pale, and she was shaking now, her hands trembling as she tried to pull Katie away from the safe. "Sweetheart, we can't. We have to go home, please." There was something in her voice that made Richard's skin crawl, not guilt over theft, but terror over discovery of something far worse. As Katie reluctantly stepped away from the safe, she did something that made Richard's heart skip a beat. She carefully placed the suspicious bills in a neat pile, separate from the others, then pulled a small piece of paper from her pocket, a page torn from a coloring book. Using a stubby pencil she'd been carrying, she began to write something in the careful, shaky letters of a first grader. "What are you doing, baby?" Margaret whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "Writing a note so the man knows about the bad money," Katie replied, with the matter-of-fact tone children use when explaining something obvious to confused adults. "Miss Johnson at school says we should always help people when they're being tricked." Richard felt his world shifting beneath him as he realized the magnitude of his misjudgment. This child wasn't a thief. She was trying to protect him from something he didn't even know existed. As Katie finished her note and placed it carefully on top of the suspicious money, Margaret scooped her up with desperate urgency, tears streaming down her face for reasons Richard couldn't begin to understand. They disappeared into the hallway, leaving behind only the lingering scent of Margaret's simple perfume and the devastating truth that Richard Sterling had been completely, utterly wrong about everything. The house fell into suffocating silence after Margaret and Katie's hurried departure. Richard remained frozen in his chair for several minutes, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure it could be heard throughout the mansion. The grandfather clock chimed 9:30, its deep tones seeming to mock his shattered assumptions about theft and betrayal. Finally, he rose on unsteady legs and approached the safe. The money lay exactly as Katie had left it, meticulously organized into neat piles, with the suspicious bills set deliberately apart. The small note she'd written sat on top of the questionable stack like an accusation, the childish handwriting barely legible in the lamplight. With trembling fingers, Richard picked up the torn piece of coloring book paper. The note was written in purple crayon, the letters crooked but determined. "Dear Mister, some of your money feels fake like the ones Daddy showed me at the fair. The bad people who gave you fake money are not nice. You should check with the bank. Love, Katie. P.S. You have very pretty books." Richard sank into his desk chair, the note clutched in his white-knuckled fist. The innocent words hit him like physical blows, each sentence demolishing another piece of his carefully constructed worldview. This child, this 6-year-old girl he'd been ready to destroy, had been trying to protect him from something he didn't even know existed. He picked up one of the bills Katie had separated, holding it up to the light as she had done. To his untrained eye, it looked perfect. The color, the feel, the intricate details all seemed legitimate. But when he compared it to the others, something nagged at him. The texture was slightly different, almost imperceptible unless you knew what to look for. How had a child noticed what he had missed? Richard's hands shook as he reached for his phone, dialing the direct number of his private banker, James Morrison, who handled his most sensitive transactions. It was nearly 10 o'clock, but James owed his career to Richard's investments and would answer regardless of the hour. "Richard, is everything all right?" James's voice carried the concerned tone of someone who knew Richard Sterling never called unless it was serious. "James, I need you to meet me at the bank tomorrow morning, first thing. I have some bills I need authenticated." Richard's voice was hoarse, the words scraping against his throat like broken glass. "Authenticated? Richard, what's going on? Has someone been passing counterfeit currency to you?" The banker's professional alarm was immediately apparent. "If so, we need to notify the authorities immediately." Richard closed his eyes, Margaret's terrified face flashing in his memory. The way she'd looked when Katie mentioned fake money, not guilty, but genuinely afraid, as if she knew something terrible was about to be revealed. "Just meet me tomorrow, James, and keep this between us for now." After hanging up, Richard poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey and slumped back into his chair. The study felt different now, contaminated by his own paranoia and the innocence of a child who had tried to help him. He thought about Margaret's 15 years of loyal service, the way she'd maintained his home with quiet dignity, never asking for anything more than her modest salary. The photograph on his desk caught his eye, a picture of him with his business partners at last year's Christmas party. David Chen, his investment partner of 20 years, stood beside him with his arm around Richard's shoulders, both men smiling broadly at the camera. Next to them, Marcus Webb, their chief financial officer, raised a champagne glass in celebration of another profitable year. Richard stared at the faces of the men he trusted with his fortune, his business, his future. One of them had access to his accounts, his transactions, his private financial information. If someone was passing him counterfeit money, it would have to be through channels he trusted implicitly. The realization sent ice water through his veins as he considered the implications. His phone rang, startling him from his dark thoughts. The caller ID showed Margaret's number, and for a moment he considered not answering, but something in Katie's innocent note compelled him to pick up. "Mr. Sterling." Margaret's voice was barely a whisper, thick with tears she was trying to suppress. I need to explain about tonight. Katie didn't mean any harm. She notices things that other people don't. Margaret, we need to talk. Tomorrow morning after I handle some business in the city, can you meet me here at 2 o'clock? Richard's voice was gentler than it had been in years, the anger replaced by something he couldn't quite identify. Am I fired? The question came out as a broken sob, and Richard felt his heart clench with guilt over his earlier assumptions. "No, Margaret, you're not fired. But there are things we need to discuss, things that might be more important than either of us realized." Richard hung up and stared at Katie's note, wondering how a 6-year-old child had managed to uncover a truth that could destroy everything he'd built. Tomorrow would bring answers, but tonight Richard Sterling sat alone in his mansion, finally understanding that the real thieves weren't the ones he'd suspected, and the danger was far greater than missing money from a safe. Richard arrived at First Manhattan Private Bank at precisely 8 a.m., his Bentley pulling up to the discreet side entrance reserved for the institution's most valuable clients. James Morrison was waiting in the marble lobby, his usually perfect composure showing cracks of concern. As the bank's vice president of private wealth management, James had handled Richard's accounts for over a decade, but he'd never seen his most important client look so haggard. "Richard, you look terrible. What's this about?" James ushered him toward the private elevator that led to the bank's authentication laboratory, a sterile room equipped with every device necessary to detect financial fraud. Richard pulled out the stack of bills Katie had identified, his hands steadier now that he was taking action. A. Consultant noticed something unusual about some of my cash reserves. I need them verified immediately. He couldn't bring himself to explain that his consultant was a 6-year-old girl with broken crayons and more wisdom than all his financial advisors combined. The authentication process took 45 minutes that felt like hours. Richard watched through the glass partition as bank specialists ran the bills through ultraviolet scanners, microscopic analysis, and chemical tests. James stood beside him, growing more agitated as each test revealed the same devastating truth. Richard, these bills are exceptionally sophisticated counterfeits. Whoever made them has access to government-grade printing equipment and insider knowledge of security features. This isn't street-level fraud. This is organized crime, or potentially even state-sponsored counterfeiting. James's professional demeanor had cracked completely, revealing genuine fear beneath. How much are we talking about? Richard's voice was barely a whisper. Based on what you've brought me, and assuming a similar percentage throughout your cash reserves, potentially $8 to $12 million in counterfeit currency. The number hung between them like a death sentence. Richard's legs nearly gave out. $12 million of his personal wealth, money he'd kept liquid for emergencies and opportunities, was worthless paper. But worse than the financial loss was the realization of what this meant. Someone close to him, someone with intimate access to his transactions, had been systematically replacing his legitimate currency with fakes. James, I need you to trace every large cash transaction I've made in the past 18 months. Every deposit, every withdrawal, every transfer. Someone's been playing a long game, and I need to know who. Richard's voice had regained its steel, the shock transforming into cold determination. As James hurried away to compile the transaction records, Richard's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. We know you found the money. Stop digging, or Margaret and the girl disappear. The blood drained from Richard's face as he realized that Kitty's innocent discovery had triggered something far more dangerous than financial fraud. His hands shaking, he immediately called Margaret's phone. It went straight to voicemail. He tried again, then again, each unanswered ring amplifying his growing panic. The little girl who had tried to help him was now in danger because of his investigation. The weight of that responsibility crushed down on him like a physical force. James returned with a thick folder of transaction records, but Richard barely glanced at them. James, I need you to contact the FBI Financial Crimes Division. Tell them we have a major counterfeiting operation and possible kidnapping threats, and I need private security, the best money can buy. Richard, what's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost. Worse, I think I've seen the future, and it's darker than I imagined. Richard pocketed the threatening text and headed for the elevator. Keep those records safe, and don't trust anyone, not even me, until this is over. The drive back to his mansion took an hour through Manhattan traffic that seemed designed to test his sanity. Every red light, every slow-moving taxi felt like a delay that might cost Margaret and Kitty their lives. The irony wasn't lost on him. 12 hours ago, he'd been ready to destroy Margaret's life over suspected theft. Now he was racing to save her from the real criminals he'd unwittingly invited into all their lives. As he pulled through the gates of his estate, Richard noticed a black sedan parked across the street that hadn't been there that morning. The windows were tinted, and he caught a glimpse of someone inside watching his movements. The game had changed from financial fraud to something much more deadly, and Richard Sterling realized he was no longer the hunter. He was the prey, but first, he had to find Margaret and Kitty before the real thieves decided that loose ends needed to be eliminated. The mansion loomed before him like a fortress that had already been breached, and somewhere in its shadows lay the answers that would either save them all or destroy everything Richard had left to protect. The note from a 6-year-old girl had unlocked a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of his business empire. And now the innocent child who'd tried to warn him was paying the price for his blindness to betrayal. Richard burst through the front doors of his mansion, calling Margaret's name before he'd even crossed the threshold. The house answered with hollow silence, his voice echoing off marble and mahogany like a ghost haunting empty rooms. The grandfather clock in the foyer chimed 11 o'clock, marking another hour of Margaret and Katie's absence. He ran through the halls with desperate energy, checking every room where Margaret normally worked. The kitchen was spotless as always, but her purse was gone from the small hook beside the pantry where she always kept it. Upstairs, he found that her cleaning supplies were still arranged in their usual precise order in the supply closet. But something felt wrong, too neat, too final, as if someone had been preparing for a permanent departure. In Margaret's small break room off the kitchen, Richard discovered something that made his blood run cold. Katie's coloring book lay open on the small table, crayons scattered across the page as if she'd been interrupted mid-drawing. The picture showed a little girl and a woman holding hands in front of a big house with the sun shining overhead. But the image was only half finished. The woman's face left blank, as if Katie had run out of time to complete her mother's features. Richard's phone rang, the sound sharp and urgent in the silent house. Margaret's number flashed on the screen, and he answered before the first ring finished. "Margaret, thank God, where are you? Are you and Katie safe? Mr. Sterling?" Margaret's voice was strained, muffled as if she were speaking through tears. "I'm sorry about last night. Katie shouldn't have been in your study. We're going away for a while. I won't be able to work for you anymore." "Margaret, don't hang up. Someone sent me a threatening text. You and Katie could be in danger because of what she discovered about the counterfeit money. Where are you? I can help." The line went dead. When Richard tried calling back, the phone went straight to voicemail, not just unanswered, but turned off completely. The silence that followed felt like a tomb closing over any chance of reaching them before it was too late. Richard sank into one of his kitchen chairs, his hands shaking as he stared at Katie's unfinished drawing. In less than 24 hours, his entire worldview had been shattered by a 6-year-old's innocent observation. And now that same innocence might have cost both her and her mother their lives. The weight of his misjudgment pressed down on him like physical pain. His phone buzzed with another text from the same unknown number. "Smart man, keep your mouth shut and everyone stays healthy. The girl was just being helpful. Make sure she stays that way." The message confirmed Richard's worst fears. Someone was watching Katie, using her and Margaret as leverage to ensure his silence about the counterfeit money. But who? And how did they know so quickly that Katie had discovered their scheme? Someone had to be monitoring his communications, his movements, maybe even his house. Richard walked back to his study, seeing the room with new eyes. The safe stood open just as he'd left it. Katie's neat piles of money still arranged exactly as her small hands had organized them. But now he noticed things he'd missed before. Tiny inconsistencies that suggested someone else had been in this room recently. A book slightly out of place, a pen moved from where he'd left it, dust patterns disturbed on surfaces Margaret never cleaned. His own home had been compromised, possibly for months or even years. The people he trusted most, his business partners, his security team, maybe even his household staff, someone among them was feeding information to the counterfeiters. The realization that his sanctuary had become a trap made his skin crawl with paranoia. As Richard stood in his violated study, staring at the innocent note that had exposed a vast conspiracy, he made a decision that would change everything. He wouldn't be the victim of intimidation, and he wouldn't let Margaret and Katie pay the price for his blindness to betrayal. If someone wanted to play games with the people he cared about, and when had he started caring so much about his housekeeper and her daughter? They would discover that Richard Sterling hadn't built his fortune by backing down from fights. But first, he needed allies he could trust absolutely, resources the conspirators didn't know about, and a plan that would save Margaret and Kitty while exposing the truth about who had been stealing from him in plain sight. The little girl who had tried to help him with purple crayon and innocent honesty deserved better than to become a casualty in someone else's war. And Richard Sterling was about to remind the world why crossing him was always a fatal mistake, even when the fight was for something more precious than money. Richard's first call was to Detective Sarah Chen of the NYPD Financial Crimes Unit, not his business partner David's sister, but a contact he'd cultivated independently years ago when investigating corporate espionage. Sarah owed him nothing, which made her the only person he could trust completely in this moment of paranoia and betrayal. "Detective Chen, this is Richard Sterling. I need to meet you somewhere private. Not your office, not my home. I have evidence of a major counterfeiting operation and possible kidnapping." His voice was steady despite the chaos in his mind. "Richard, slow down. Kidnapping. Are you in immediate danger yet?" Sarah's professional instincts kicked in immediately. They'd worked together on 3 corporate fraud cases over the years, and she'd never heard him sound this shaken. "Not me, my housekeeper and her 6-year-old daughter. They discovered the counterfeit money, and now they've disappeared." Richard paused, the weight of his words hitting him fully. "Sarah, I think someone's been watching my house, monitoring my communications. We need to meet somewhere completely neutral." 2 hours later, Richard sat across from Detective Chen in a small cafe in Queens, far from his usual Manhattan haunts. Sarah studied the threatening text messages and bank authentication reports with the focused intensity that had made her one of the NYPD's most successful financial investigators. "Richard, this is bigger than corporate fraud. These bills are too sophisticated for local criminals. We're talking about international counterfeiting operations, possibly state-sponsored, and the fact that they're threatening civilians means they're desperate to keep this quiet." Sarah looked up from the documents, her expression grave. "Tell me about Margaret Torres. How long has she worked for you?" 15 years. She's been completely trustworthy, never missing a day, never asking for anything beyond her salary. She's been like—" Richard stopped, surprised by the emotion in his voice. "She's been like family. And her daughter, Kitty. Tell me about her." Sarah pulled out a notepad, her pen poised to capture every detail. Richard found himself smiling despite the circumstances as he described Kitty's innocent discovery of the counterfeit bills, her careful organization of his money, the purple crayon note that had started this entire nightmare. "She's just a little girl, Sarah. 6 years old, smart as hell, and now she's in danger because she tried to help me." Sarah studied Richard's face as he spoke about Kitty, noting something she'd never seen in the 15 years she'd known him, genuine paternal concern. "Richard, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Is there any possibility that Kitty could be more than just your housekeeper's daughter?" The question hit Richard like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" "You said Margaret has worked for you for 15 years. Kitty is 6. That means Margaret was working for you when she got pregnant. You've never been married, no known children, and you're describing this child with an affection that goes beyond employer sympathy." Sarah leaned forward, her voice gentle but insistent. "Richard, could Kitty be your daughter?" Richard's mind reeled as Sarah's words sank in. 15 years ago, he'd been a different man, younger, lonelier, working 18-hour days building his empire. Margaret had been there through everything. the quiet presence who kept his life organized while he conquered the business world. And there had been that one night, 7 years ago, when they'd both been working late, and the boundaries between employer and employee had blurred in ways neither of them acknowledged afterward. I never thought. I never. Richard's voice cracked as memories flooded back. Margaret's unexplained absence 6 years ago, claiming family emergency. Her return to work with a baby daughter she'd said was from a previous relationship. The way Kitty sometimes looked at him with eyes that seemed familiar, expressions that reminded him of his own childhood photographs. Richard, we need to find them, and we need to find them now. But first, you need to understand what we're really dealing with. Someone close to you, someone with intimate access to your business and personal life, has been running a long-term counterfeiting operation using your reputation and resources. The fact that they're threatening Kitty specifically suggests they know something about her importance to you that maybe even you didn't realize. Sarah pulled out her phone and dialed a number. I'm calling in federal backup. The FBI has a task force that specializes in sophisticated counterfeiting operations. But Richard, I need you to promise me something. No matter what we discover about Kitty's parentage, no matter who's behind this conspiracy, you let law enforcement handle it. No vigilante justice, no matter how personal this becomes. Richard nodded, but inside he was already making different plans. If Kitty was his daughter, and the possibility felt more real with every passing minute, then whoever had threatened her had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The people who thought they could intimidate Richard Sterling by targeting an innocent child had clearly forgotten that he hadn't built his fortune by playing by other people's rules. His phone buzzed with another text from the unknown number. Stop looking for them. Some secrets are worth more than money, and some children are worth more than you know. The message confirmed Sarah's suspicions and Richard's growing fears. This wasn't just about counterfeit money anymore. This was about Kitty, about secrets that someone would kill to protect, and about a truth that could change everything Richard thought he knew about his life. As he stared at the threatening words on his phone screen, Richard Sterling realized that the next few hours would determine not just whether he could save Margaret and Kitty, but whether he was ready to embrace a family he'd never known he had. The FBI field office in Lower Manhattan buzzed with controlled urgency as Special Agent Rebecca Martinez spread the counterfeit bills across her desk like a deadly poker hand. Sarah Chen stood beside Richard, both of them watching as the Federal Task Force's lead investigator examined Kitty's innocent discovery with the intensity of someone who'd seen this pattern before. Mr. Sterling, these bills are part of a series we've been tracking for 8 months. Operation Golden Thread, a counterfeiting ring that's been targeting high-net-worth individuals across the East Coast. But you're the first victim whose household staff discovered the fakes. Agent Martinez looked up from her magnifying glass, her dark eyes sharp with interest. Tell me more about this child who identified them. Richard found himself describing Kitty again, but this time, as he spoke about her unusual intelligence and the way she'd organized his money with such care, something clicked in his memory. Agent Martinez, Margaret once mentioned that Kitty's father taught her about money, how to recognize real from fake. At the time, I thought she meant carnival games or something innocent. But what if? What if her father was involved in financial crimes? Agent Martinez finished his thought. Mr. Sterling, we need Margaret's full employment records, background check information, emergency contacts, everything you have on her. As Richard scrolled through his phone for Margaret's employment file, Agent Martinez pulled up a series of photographs on her computer screen. These are our known associates in the Golden Thread operation. Most are sophisticated criminals with backgrounds in printing, banking, or currency exchange. Take a look and tell me if any of these faces seem familiar." Richard studied the photos, expecting to see hardened criminals and foreign operatives. Instead, his blood turned to ice as he recognized the third face in the series, Marcus Webb, his chief financial officer and trusted partner for over a decade. The man who had access to all his accounts, who handled his cash transactions, who knew every detail of his financial operations. "Marcus," Richard whispered, the betrayal hitting him like a physical blow. "Marcus Webb. He's been my CFO for 12 years. He has keys to my house, access to my safe combination, complete knowledge of my cash reserves." Agent Martinez's fingers flew across her keyboard, pulling up Marcus Webb's file. "Corporate executive, clean record, married with 2 children. Wait." Her expression darkened as she scrolled through more recent intelligence. "Mr. Sterling, Marcus Webb's wife, filed for divorce 6 months ago, citing financial problems and gambling debts. He's been under tremendous pressure, facing alimony payments that would destroy his lifestyle." The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place with terrifying clarity. Marcus had been replacing Richard's legitimate currency with counterfeits gradually, probably over months, skimming the real money to cover his gambling debts and divorce settlements. But Keaty's innocent observation had threatened to expose the entire operation. "Agent Martinez, if Marcus is behind this, he knows I'm investigating. He probably has my phones monitored, my house under surveillance. Margaret and Keaty aren't just witnesses. They're the only people who can prove when and how the counterfeit money was discovered." Richard's voice grew cold with determination. He has to eliminate them to protect himself. Sarah Chen pulled out her phone, already dialing. "I'm getting units to Marcus Webb's home and office immediately. Richard, do you have any idea where he might take hostages, properties he owns, places he frequents, anywhere he might feel safe?" Richard's mind raced through everything he knew about Marcus. 15 years of friendship, business dinners, family gatherings. He has a cabin in the Catskills about 2 hours north of the city. It's isolated. Off the grid for weekends, if he's holding them somewhere. Agent Martinez was already coordinating with tactical teams, but Richard could see the concern in her eyes. "Mr. Sterling, hostage situations involving children are extremely volatile. If Marcus Webb is desperate enough to threaten a 6-year-old, he's capable of anything. We need to move fast, but we also need to be smart." As the federal agents mobilized their resources, Richard's phone rang. Marcus's name appeared on the caller ID, and for a moment the room fell silent with tension. Agent Martinez nodded for him to answer, quickly attaching a recording device to capture the conversation. "Richard, old friend. I heard you had some excitement at the bank this morning. Funny how rumors travel in our business." Marcus's voice carried its usual jovial tone, but underneath, Richard could hear something new, a desperate edge that hadn't been there before. "Marcus, where are Margaret and Keaty? If you hurt them, hurt them." "Richard, you misunderstand the situation completely. I'm protecting them. That little girl stumbled onto something very dangerous, and there are people who would do terrible things to keep their secrets safe. Lucky for you, I'm one of the good guys." Marcus's laugh was hollow, the sound of a man trying to convince himself of his own lies. "Then bring them home, Marcus. We can work this out, whatever the problem is. You don't need to involve innocent people." "Innocent?" Marcus's voice sharpened. "Richard, there's something you don't know about your precious Margaret and her daughter. Something that changes everything about this situation. Meet me at the old warehouse on Pier 47 in 2 hours. Come alone, and maybe we can all walk away from this with what we really want." The line went dead, leaving Richard staring at his phone while Agent Martinez and her team processed the implications of Marcus's call. But it was Sarah Chen who voiced what everyone was thinking. "Richard, he said Margaret and Katie weren't innocent. What if there's more to this story than we know? What if Margaret has been working with Marcus all along?" The possibility that Margaret might be complicit in the counterfeiting operation hit Richard like a second betrayal, but something deep in his gut rejected the idea. The terror in her voice the night before, the way she'd protected Katie, the 15 years of loyalty, none of it felt like an act. But as he prepared to walk into what was obviously a trap, Richard Sterling realized that nothing in his life was what it had seemed, and the truth about Katie, Margaret, and his own past was about to be revealed in the most dangerous way possible. Pier 47 stretched into the Hudson River like a concrete finger pointing toward the gathering darkness of evening. Richard arrived 30 minutes early, despite Agent Martinez's protests, driving his Bentley through the maze of abandoned warehouses that lined this forgotten section of Manhattan's waterfront. FBI surveillance teams were already in position, invisible among the shadows and shipping containers. But Richard felt utterly alone as he parked outside the rusted warehouse Marcus had specified. The building loomed against the cloudy sky like a monument to New York's industrial past, its broken windows staring blindly at the river. Richard checked his phone one last time. No messages, no calls, no word from Margaret or Katie. The silence felt like death itself, and he fought down the panic that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. Inside the warehouse, footsteps echoed off concrete and steel as Richard made his way toward a dim light in the center of the vast space. Marcus stood beneath a single hanging bulb, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled as if he'd been sleeping in it. But it was the sight beyond Marcus that made Richard's heart stop. Margaret and Katie sat on folding chairs, their hands zip-tied behind them, both looking terrified but unharmed. "Richard, thank God you came." Margaret's voice cracked with relief and terror. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry about all of this." Katie looked smaller than ever in the harsh warehouse lighting, her yellow dress dirty from whatever ordeal they'd endured. But when she saw Richard, her face lit up with the innocent trust that only children possess. "Mister, I'm sorry if my note got you in trouble. I just wanted to help." The sight of them bound and frightened ignited a rage in Richard that threatened to consume his rationality. But Marcus raised his hand, and Richard saw the gun pointed directly at Katie's small form. "Easy, old friend. We're all going to have a very civilized conversation about the future. Marcus, what the hell has gotten into you? 15 years of partnership, of friendship, and you're pointing a gun at a child?" Richard's voice carried all the authority he'd used to build his empire, but here, in this abandoned warehouse, it felt hollow against the reality of Marcus's desperation. "Friendship," Marcus laughed bitterly. "Richard, you have no idea what real desperation feels like. My wife took everything in the divorce, the house, the kids, half my assets. The gambling debts were crushing me, and I needed time to recover. The counterfeit operation was supposed to be temporary, just enough to get back on my feet. So you've been stealing from me for months, replacing my money with fakes, and now you're threatening innocent people to cover your tracks." Richard took a step closer, but Marcus gestured with the gun, forcing him to stop. "Innocent? Richard, you still don't understand what's really happening here." Marcus turned to Margaret, his expression shifting to something like pity. "Tell him. Margaret, tell him the truth about Katie, about why she's so special, about why certain people would pay millions to get their hands on her." Margaret's face went completely white, and she shook her head desperately. "Marcus, please. She's just a little girl. This has nothing to do with her." "Nothing to do with her?" Marcus's voice rose to near hysteria. "Margaret, she's not just any little girl. She's Richard Sterling's daughter, and she's also the daughter of Antonio Reeves, the most wanted counterfeiter in the world." The warehouse fell into absolute silence as Marcus's words echoed off the concrete walls. Richard felt the floor shift beneath him as the impossible truth crashed over him like a wave. Katie wasn't just his daughter, she was also the child of a master criminal, a man whose counterfeiting skills were legendary in law enforcement circles. Antonio taught her to recognize fake money because it's in her blood, Richard. She has an inherited talent for detecting counterfeit currency that makes her incredibly valuable to certain criminal organizations and incredibly dangerous to others. Marcus's gun never wavered as he continued his revelation. Margaret has been hiding her from both sides, from Antonio's enemies who want revenge, and from law enforcement who want to use her as bait. Richard looked at Margaret, seeing her 15 years of loyal service in a completely new light. She hadn't been just his housekeeper. She'd been protecting their daughter from a world that would either exploit her gifts or destroy her because of her father's crimes. The sacrifice she'd made, the life she'd given up to keep Katie safe, hit him with overwhelming force. "Margaret, is it true? Is Katie my daughter?" Richard's voice was barely a whisper, but in the echoing warehouse, every word carried clearly. Margaret's tears fell silently as she nodded. "The night we were working late, 7 years ago, when you were going through the divorce proceedings with your ex-wife, we were both lonely, both hurting, and afterward, I found out I was pregnant. But by then, I'd also discovered that my ex-boyfriend Antonio was a wanted criminal. I couldn't tell you the truth because it would have put you in danger too." Katie looked between the adults with the confused expression of a child trying to understand why the grown-ups were so upset. "Mama, why is everyone crying? And why does the man with the gun look so scared?" Marcus wiped sweat from his forehead with his free hand, the weapon shaking slightly as the weight of his actions began to overwhelm him. "Because, little one, your mama and your father are about to make a choice that will determine whether you live or die, and I'm the man who has to make sure they choose correctly." Richard felt something fundamental shift inside him as he looked at Katie, his daughter, the child he'd never known existed, now threatened because of his own blindness to betrayal. The business empire he'd spent his life building suddenly felt worthless compared to the small girl in the yellow dress who had tried to help him with purple crayon and innocent honesty. In that moment, Richard Sterling realized that everything he thought mattered was about to be redefined by what happened in the next few minutes. The warehouse trembled as heavy footsteps echoed from multiple entrances, and suddenly the space erupted with tactical lights and shouted commands. "FBI, drop your weapon!" Agent Martinez and her team moved with military precision, surrounding Marcus from 3 directions while keeping clear lines of sight away from the hostages. But Marcus didn't drop the gun. Instead, he pressed it closer to Katie's head, his hands shaking with desperation and exhaustion. "Stay back, all of you! This is bigger than any of you understand. Marcus, please!" Richard stepped forward, his hands raised in surrender. "You want money? Take everything I have. You want my business? It's yours. Just let them go." "You still don't get it," Marcus's voice cracked with hysteria. "This isn't about money anymore. Antonio Reeves has put a $10 million bounty on his daughter's head. He wants her back, and there are people here tonight who aren't FBI." Agent Martinez's blood ran cold as Marcus's words sank in. She quickly activated her radio, calling for immediate perimeter checks, but the damage was already done. In the shadows between shipping containers, figures moved with predatory precision. Antonio's men had found them. "Daddy!" Kitty's small voice cut through the chaos like a knife. Everyone turned to see a man emerging from the darkness at the far end of the warehouse, tall, lean, with the same dark eyes as his daughter. Antonio Reeves walked toward them with the confident stride of someone who'd never learned to fear anything. "Hello, Princess." Antonio's voice was gentle as he addressed Katie, but his eyes burned with cold fury as he looked at Margaret. "Mama's been hiding you from Daddy for a very long time." Margaret struggled against her restraints. terror and maternal protection warring in her expression. "Antonio, please, she's safe here. She has a good life. Don't drag her into your world." "My world?" Antonio laughed, the sound echoing eerily off the concrete walls. "Margaret, darling, she's already in my world." The moment she touched that counterfeit money and recognized it for what it was, she proved she has the gift. My gift. And that makes her more valuable than any amount of money. Richard found his voice, stepping between Antonio and his daughter. "She's my daughter too, and I'll die before I let you take her." Antonio studied Richard with calculating eyes, taking in the expensive suit, the obvious wealth, the protective stance of a father discovering his child for the first time. "Richard Sterling, Margaret told me about you years ago, the lonely billionaire who thought money could buy anything, but you can't buy what I can teach her." "Oh, I can protect her from your enemies," Richard shot back. "I can give her a safe life, education, opportunities you never could." "Protection?" Antonio gestured toward Marcus, who was still holding the gun with shaking hands. "Your own business partner just betrayed you and threatened to kill her. Your protection led her straight into danger." Agent Martinez tried to regain control of the rapidly deteriorating situation. "Mr. Reeves, you're wanted by federal authorities in 12 countries. Surrender now, and we can discuss arrangements for supervised visitation with your daughter." Antonio's laughter was harsh and bitter. "Supervised visitation? Agent Martinez, do you know what they call me in certain circles? The ghost printer. I've created currency so perfect that central banks couldn't detect it. Do you really think federal prison can hold me?" The standoff stretched taut as everyone realized they were trapped in an impossible situation. Marcus couldn't release Kitty without losing his only bargaining chip. Antonio wouldn't leave without his daughter. The FBI couldn't act without risking the child's life. And Richard stood in the middle, a father for less than an hour, facing choices that would define the rest of his life. Then Katie did something that changed everything. She looked directly at Marcus, her 6-year-old eyes filled with innocent wisdom, and said, "Mister, you're scared because you made bad choices. But pointing that gun at me won't fix anything. My mama taught me that when we make mistakes, we have to be brave enough to make them right." The simple honesty of her words hit Marcus like a physical blow. His hand began to shake more violently, and tears streamed down his face as the full weight of what he'd become crashed over him. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "God help me, I'm so sorry." The gun clattered to the concrete floor as Marcus collapsed to his knees, overwhelmed by the realization that he'd threatened to kill an innocent child to save his own skin. But his surrender only triggered the next phase of the crisis, as Antonio's men moved closer through the shadows, and Agent Martinez realized that the real battle for Kitty's future was just beginning. In that moment of chaos and revelation, Richard Sterling understood that money, power, and business success meant nothing compared to the trust shining in his daughter's eyes. Whatever happened next, he would not let her down the way he'd let down everyone else in his life. The little girl who had tried to help him with purple crayon had given him something more valuable than his entire fortune, a chance to be the father he'd never known he wanted to become. The warehouse erupted into chaos as Antonio's men emerged from the shadows, their weapons trained on the FBI agents who suddenly found themselves outnumbered and outgunned. Agent Martinez made split-second tactical decisions, directing her team to form a protective circle around the civilians while calling for immediate backup that might arrive too late to matter. "Stand down, everyone!" Antonio's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Nobody needs to die tonight, but my daughter comes with me. That's non-negotiable." Richard moved closer to Kitty, his protective instincts overriding any concern for his own safety. "You're not taking her anywhere. I just found out I'm her father. I'm not losing her now." "Father?" Antonio's expression shifted to something that might have been amusement. "Richard, you contributed genetic materials 7 years ago. I've been searching for her since she was born. Which one of us do you think she needs more?" Margaret, still bound to her chair but fighting against the restraints, looked between the two men with desperation in her eyes. "Stop fighting over her like she's property. Katie is a little girl who needs stability, safety and love, not to be the center of some custody battle between a criminal and a man who didn't even know she existed until today." Agent Martinez kept her weapon trained on Antonio while trying to coordinate with her scattered team through her earpiece. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, with too many armed criminals, too many civilians in danger, and too many competing agendas colliding in one confined space. Then Katie spoke, her small voice somehow carrying clearly through all the adult chaos and conflict. "Mama, why is everyone so angry? And why does that man say he's my daddy when you told me my daddy was gone forever?" The innocent question struck everyone into momentary silence. Margaret's face crumpled as she realized her careful web of protective lies was unraveling in the worst possible way. "Baby, I'm sorry. I tried to keep you safe by not telling you the truth about your family. But I like the nice man with the books," Katie continued, looking at Richard with the trusting expression that had melted his heart in his study. "He has a kind face, even when he looks sad, and the scary man with the gun looks like me, but he feels dangerous." Antonio's expression softened despite himself as he looked at his daughter, seeing his own features reflected in her small face. "Princess, I know I look scary, but I'm your daddy. I've been looking for you for so long because I love you, and I want to teach you amazing things. The man who taught me about fake money was my daddy." Katie's eyes widened with understanding. "But Mama said you went away because bad people were chasing you. Are you still being chased by bad people?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Antonio looked around the warehouse at the FBI agents, the weapons, the chaos his presence had created, and for the first time, he seemed to grasp the full impact of his lifestyle on his daughter's safety. Richard seized the moment, kneeling down to Katie's eye level despite the danger surrounding them. "Katie, I know this is confusing, but I want you to know that I care about you very much. You helped me when you organized my money and wrote that note. Now I want to help you. Like how I helped you with the fake money?" Katie asked with the logical curiosity of a child trying to understand adult complications. "Exactly like that. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes and need help fixing them. Your mama has been trying to protect you. Your other daddy wants to be with you, and I want to keep you safe, but the most important thing is what you want." Agent Martinez watched this surreal family discussion unfold while maintaining tactical awareness of Antonio's armed men positioned throughout the warehouse. She realized that the key to resolving this standoff might not be superior firepower, but the wisdom of a 6-year-old girl who saw the situation more clearly than any of the adults involved. Antonio stepped closer, his voice gentler than it had been since entering the warehouse. "Princess, I know I've been gone, and I know that's hurt you and Mama. But I can teach you things about numbers and patterns and how money works that no school ever could. You have a special gift, and I can help you understand it." "But if I go with you, will the bad people chase me too?" Katie asked, with the devastating honesty that only children possess. "And will Mama be safe? And will the nice bookman be sad?" The question forced Antonio to confront a truth he'd been avoiding, that loving his daughter might mean staying away from her. His criminal lifestyle, the enemies he'd made, the constant danger that surrounded him, all of it would follow Katie if she came with him. For the first time since entering the warehouse, the master counterfeiter looked uncertain. Richard stood slowly, his business instincts recognizing an opportunity for negotiation. "Antonio, you love her. I love her. Margaret loves her. But love means protecting her, even from ourselves if necessary. What if there was a way for all of us to be part of her life without putting her in danger? As the three adults looked at each other across the weapon-filled warehouse, each seeing their own hopes and fears reflected in the other's faces, Katie made a sound that stopped everyone's heart. She was crying, not the dramatic sobs of a child throwing a tantrum, but the quiet tears of someone who understood that the grown-ups she cared about were hurting each other because of her. The sight of his daughter's tears broke something fundamental in both men, and in that moment, Richard Sterling and Antonio Reeves realized they had something more important in common than either had expected. They both wanted to protect the little girl who had changed everything with purple crayon and innocent honesty. The sight of Katie's tears created a moment of absolute silence in the warehouse, as if the entire world had paused to witness a 6-year-old girl's heartbreak. Agent Martinez used the distraction to signal her team, who slowly began repositioning for a coordinated response, but even they seemed reluctant to shatter the fragile humanity that had suddenly descended over the armed standoff. "Princess, don't cry," Antonio whispered, his voice breaking as he knelt down to his daughter's level. "Daddy's here now. Everything's going to be okay." "But everyone's angry because of me," Katie sobbed, her small shoulders shaking. "I just wanted to help with the fake money, and now Mama's tied up and everyone has guns, and you're all fighting." Richard felt his heart shatter as he watched his daughter blame herself for the chaos created by adult greed, betrayal, and criminal ambition. He looked at Antonio and saw the same anguish reflected in the other man's eyes, the devastating realization that their conflict was traumatizing the child they both claimed to love. "Katie, sweetheart, none of this is your fault," Richard said gently, ignoring the weapons trained on him from multiple directions. "You did exactly the right thing when you found the fake money. You tried to help, and that's what heroes do." Margaret, still struggling against her restraints, watched the two fathers of her child with growing amazement. 7 years of separation, fear and secrets were crumbling in the face of Katie's innocent pain. "Antonio, Richard, please, look at what this is doing to her. She needs peace, not a war between her fathers." Antonio studied Richard's face, seeing not a rival but another man destroyed by the realization of what they'd almost lost. "You really didn't know about her until today?" "I had no idea," Richard admitted. "If I had known, I would have moved heaven and earth to protect both of them. 7 years of missed birthdays, first steps, first words." His voice cracked with the weight of lost time. "And I've missed 6 years because I was too proud to stay hidden, too dangerous to come home." Antonio's admission was barely audible, but it carried the force of a confession. "Every day I wondered if she was safe, if she remembered me, if Margaret was telling her stories to help her not hate her daddy for leaving." Agent Martinez realized that the emotional breakthrough might be the key to resolving the standoff peacefully. "Mr. Reeves, Mr. Sterling, what if there was a way to ensure Katie's safety while allowing both of you to be part of her life? Witness protection, new identities, a fresh start for all of you." "I won't go into hiding," Richard said immediately. "My business, my life, everything I've built is worthless if our daughter dies because of our pride," Antonio finished. "Richard, I've spent 6 years being hunted. You've spent 6 years being alone. Maybe it's time we both learned what really matters." Marcus, who had been sitting in devastated silence since dropping his weapon, suddenly looked up with desperate hope in his eyes. "The Swiss accounts. Richard, I can give you the locations of every account where I stashed the real money. Enough to start over anywhere, to keep Katie safe forever." Richard barely glanced at his former partner, his attention entirely focused on his daughter. "Katie, what do you want? All of us adults have been making decisions about your life without asking you. What would make you happy? Katie wiped her eyes with the back of her small hand, considering the question with the serious concentration she'd shown when organizing his money. I want Mama to not be scared anymore. I want my daddies to be friends instead of fighting. And I want to learn about numbers and books, and maybe help more people who get tricked by fake money. The simplicity of her wishes, safety for her mother, peace between her fathers, and the chance to use her gifts to help others, highlighted the complexity the adults had created around what should have been straightforward love and protection. Antonio looked at Agent Martinez with something approaching respect. What kind of protection are you talking about? Full relocation, new identities? A complete witness protection for all of you if Richard agrees to testify against the counterfeiting network his investigation exposed. New lives, new names, but most importantly, safety for Katie while she grows up. Richard felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Everything he'd worked for, his empire, his reputation, his identity as Richard Sterling, all of it would disappear. But as he looked at his daughter's tear-stained face, the choice became crystal clear. Yes, he said without hesitation. Yes to all of it. The business, the money, the name. None of it matters compared to her safety. Antonio stood slowly. His hands raised to show he was no longer a threat. My men, stand down. Agent Martinez, we accept your offer, but I have one condition. I help you track down the other counterfeiting networks. My knowledge, my contacts, everything I know about the criminal organizations threatening our daughter. And as FBI agents moved in to secure the scene and begin processing the unprecedented surrender of one of the world's most wanted criminals, Katie looked between her two fathers with something approaching satisfaction. So now you're both going to help catch bad guys? Like superheroes? Richard and Antonio exchanged a look that carried 7 years of misunderstanding, and for the first time, both men smiled. Yes, Princess, Antonio said, like superheroes. 6 months later, in a small coastal town in Oregon, a man named Michael Thompson walked hand in hand with his 6-year-old daughter Katie down to the beach where her mother Sarah was building sandcastles. In the distance, a man who now called himself David Martinez waved from the deck of his modest house, where he was grading the financial literacy workbooks he'd created for the local elementary school. The 3 adults had learned to share custody of their remarkable daughter, who had inherited her father's gift for recognizing patterns and her other father's determination to protect others from being cheated. She was already helping the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit develop new training materials for detecting counterfeit currency, using games and puzzles that made learning feel like play.